Thanks, David. So my name is Cesar Hidalgo, and I work at the MIT Media Lab. And in order to tell you a little bit what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to ask you first to do a very simple exercise. And the exercise is for you guys to imagine a word. You can imagine any word, but I'm going to ask you to visualize that word. Now, if you're not very creative, you can pick up a word from the screen, or you can pick the word wired. That's fine. And on the meantime, they're going to make sure that my presentation works, because what we're going to do with that word is we're going to visualize it, and now, hopefully, that everybody has visualized a word, I'm going to ask you, how does it look? And imagine that I imagine the word dog, and I'm thinking about the word, not about the animal. So if I'm thinking about the word dog, for me, it looks like a big D, an O, and a G, all in caps. And my question to you is, well, does the word dog actually look like that? And the answer is obviously, heck no. For hundreds of thousands of years, we have had language that was not written, and the fact that the word dog looks like a D, an O, and a G is something that is actually quite recent. But the fact that we visualize the word that way, tells us something, which is that we're not actually visualizing, the object, or we're not visualizing, like the way that a word really would look like, which is a set of vibrations in air. We're visualizing the way that the word has been mediated, okay? So we're visualizing the word through that media, and the media, for words is the written language, Just like the media for collection of words could be like a book. So if you think about it, the story of information is a little bit the story of how we sort of find ways of mediating, this physical order in ways that we can visualize it, we can analyze it, we can process it, we can understand it, we can recombine it, And when it comes to, words, we have writing. When it comes to then pictures, we develop photographs, and we can put photographs in magazines, we can put them on the web. When it comes to moving pictures, we have film, and we have developed a whole set of media. But when it comes to data, the question is, how does data look like? How does the media for data look like? How does a data set look like? And obviously the answer is I don't know. And when the answer is I don't know, well, the best thing that you can do is try to figure it out, try to invent it yourself. So what I'm going to be showing you guys today is a number of different visualization engines, which are tools that allow you to visualize large data sets. And the nice thing about this is that they don't only allow us to visualize large data sets, but allows us to extract stories out of them. And as we extract stories out of them, we're learning things about the world. We're drawing insight. So the first example that I'm going to show you, and I'm a brave man because I'm not going to be using the slides, I'm going to be doing things live from the web. So everything can fail. Okay? It's the Observatory of Economic Complexity. This is a tool that makes available data for international trade for the last 50 years. It produces roughly 20 million interactive visualizations, and you can ask things like, let's say, what does the United Kingdom export? And it would fetch the data, and it would visualize it, in a form that it would be relatively simple for you to understand. So this is a very simple visual. You see that, wow, the the UK, exports a lot of cars, gas turbines, and so forth. But you can obviously, try to slice this a little bit finer. So you can ask yourself, let's say, where do the beans that you guys eat for breakfast come from? And you say, well, now you're looking at the import origins of legumes to the UK. And you can say, well, let's say, what does the UK now export to Chile, which is a much more specific question. And you see that export gas turbines, a large construction vehicle, electrical generating sets, also plenty of cars and a lot of crude petroleum. And then was that Chile exports to the UK, and you see that actually, it's quite different. There is wine, there is grapes, other fruits, fruit juice, and so forth. So here you already start seeing a bit of a contrast. You see that, for example, the products that the UK exports to Chile are products that involve a great degree of design and technical capacity, while the products that Chile is exporting to the UK, are products that actually are much more simpler. They grow on trees, most of them, or some of them, after they grow on trees, they get squished. Like the wine. So now you look at this and you say, well, this is kind of shallow. This is just a bunch of square boxes with colors. And I say, yeah, fair enough. I've shown you so far just a bunch of square boxes with colors. But the thing is, and as I promised, that we can learn some deep lessons out of this. And one of the lessons that we can learn out of this is that when you look at this box, instead of thinking that we're just seeing data of what the UK exports, what you realize, when you think a little bit deeper, is that what you're seeing here is a footprint, or like a fingerprint. And this is like a fingerprint of the economy of the UK, which is very disaggregated. It's sort of like if we were doing, like a genetic screen, and we would be looking at a bunch of SNPs, and let us know a little bit about the knowledge that is available in the networks of people, that form the UK economy. We know that it's people that have, ability of mechanical engineer, as you see that they produce cars and gas turbines, but also in chemistry, as they do medicaments and refined petroleum and so forth. It's also a very diverse economy. And if I would look, let's say, at the economy of another country, like that of Chile, which is where I come from, obviously you're going to see a very different footprint. And the nice thing about, these footprints is that these footprints do not only, let us know what countries make, but they allow us to create theories about the evolution of economies that are actually predictive, So in the case of Chile, you see a different footprint. You see that it's refined copper, copper ore, grapes, wine, fish, and so forth. And this footprint, because they tell us about the knowledge and the capacities and the institutions that exist inside a country, as these are expressed in the mix of products that they make, are going to let us be predictive about two things. One thing is we're going to have a theory that is very predictive about the products that a country is going to make in the future, and they're going to stop making in the future. So we're going to actually anticipate the evolution of economies. The other thing is that we're going to be able to anticipate, the level of future economic growth. Why? Because here what we have in these footprints is not the capacity to buy, which is always what is emphasized when we're making descriptions about the economy, because you can cheat the capacity to buy in many different ways. I can borrow a lot of money, and I can buy a lot of things for a while, then obviously things are going to get tough. I can be lucky enough to have a lot of mineral resources, and that can increase my capacity to buy. But your capacity to make, which is the one that is expressed in these footprints, is the one that is actually much harder to cheat. So let me show you now a different visualization, from the same engine, which is a little bit more convoluted and difficult to explain, but, I'm sure that we're going to be able to go through it fine. So here I'm looking at Chile, and I'm also looking at the productive structure of Chile, but I'm looking at it through a different visualization that allows me to understand what Chile makes and what they could make, because we can see how things are in context. So you see that there are different dots here. And each one of these dots, for instance, represents a product. So that dot there is frozen fish fillets. This dot here is crustaceans and mollusks. And this dot here is fish preserved. Now, you see that some dots are painted, and some dots are gray. The dots that are painted are the products that Chile exported in 1980. Because that's the slice of data that we're looking at here. The ones that are not painted, the ones that are gray, are the ones that they did not export too much of. So now, as we zoom out, you can see, okay, so Chile is involved in that fish cluster there. It's also involved in this yellow cluster. What the heck is here? So it's prepared fruit, miscellaneous fruit. There's also vegetables, but vegetables, they are connected to a lot of products that Chile is exporting in 1980, but they're not exporting too many vegetables at that time. So what you can think is now, by looking at this map, you can say, well, if I'm going to make a bet, and I'm going to say which are the products that Chile is going to export in the future, I'm going to bet towards products that are close to the ones that you're already making. Now, how do I know which products are close to other products? Well, in this case, I know through, the same fingerprints that I'm using for expression. I know that two products are similar if they tend to be co-exported. So I know, that, for example, here I have fruit jams, and that fruit jams are similar to fruit or vegetable juices because the countries that tend to export one also tend to export the other one. And that's how I know that Chile, would be able to move, from these products like prepared fruit, to the fruit vegetable juices. So let's try to see how that prediction pans out. So we're in 1980, and we see that, for example, here in the fish cluster, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 guys that Chile is not exporting, exporting everything else. Here in the processed food clusters, you see all of the yellow, but there's also a lot of things that are not being exported there. So we're going to go up to the year 1995, and lo and behold, you see the year 1995, and basically they move to everywhere there. So now they do fish preserved, they do the frozen fish, and also, now they are exporting, those fruit juices, that you guys may like. So you see that now when you're looking at these fingerprints, you have actually something that allows you to understand the economy a little bit deeper, because you have something that allows you also to even predict what countries are going to make in the future. But as I was telling you before, the change in paradigm here is that we're looking not at consumption, but we're looking at production, and we're looking at your capacity to make. And based on that, we're going to be able to predict, the ability of countries to grow. So here what I'm going to show you, I'm not going to go into the details of how you calculate these metrics, but you can create a metric that tells you how capable is an economy of producing sophisticated products by looking at the mix of products that they're producing at a certain point in time. And this is a metric that is called economic complexity. And when you compare economic complexity, with the income per capita of a country, with the capacity to buy, you find that there's a relatively good correlation between the two. Okay? The red dots here are countries that export a lot of raw materials, and they can sort of cheat the relationship because if you have enough raw materials, you can have a great capacity to buy without having a great capacity to make. The countries in blue, on the other hand, are not that lucky, and therefore they stick more closely to the relationship. But the nice thing about this relationship is that even though it's strong, it is imperfect. So you have countries down here, for example, like India, who have the capacity to make comparable to that of Greece, Russia, Brazil, or Uruguay. But they have an income that is obviously much, much smaller, from what you can see on the y-axis. A country like China or Thailand, China has the productive capacity of Spain, the Netherlands, and Hong Kong, but also has an income that is much, much smaller. So these are countries that are doomed to grow, because their capacity to make is so high compared to the countries that they're competing with that they should be able, to grow over the next years. On the other hand, countries like Greece up here, are countries that they have, an income that was too high for their capacity to make, and they should have problems with their economy. So what we can do here is we can take the distance between the dot, and the line, and use that to predict future economic growth. And the thing is, it works like a charm. So we have a method that allows us to explain more or less 50% of the variance in future economic growth, 15 years in advance, and that trumps and beats the hell out of any measure of, education, institutions, and competitiveness. So now when you go back and you look at like these little footprints and you see these little simple squares, you say, yeah, sure, they're simple squares and they're kind of, maybe, very simple in that regard, but they tell us something deeper about the world. They're telling us that actually by focusing on what countries make, we have a better way of explaining, how their industries evolve, what knowledge they have available in their populations, and even if they're going to grow. So within that context, we've kept on developing other data visualization engines that allow us to make this data accessible, but also, that serves as Trojan horses for ideas. Because here, as you can see, I show you little square boxes, and I gave you, in some way, under the table, a model of economic development. Okay? So what I'm going to show you next, is Data Viva, and this is a visualization engine that is an order of magnitude larger. This makes available data for all the formal sector economy of Brazil. This is data more than, in the formal sector economy of Brazil, there's actually 50 million people that participate a year. These are all the people that basically pay taxes. Okay? And this visualization engine makes more than 100 million visualizations accessible. So what you can do with a data visualization engine like Data Viva, in its first incarnation, and there's a new incarnation coming in December, you can very quickly create reports to try to understand the industrial structure of locations. So let's, for example, choose Santa Rita do Sapucaí, which is a place that I'm sure that you have not heard of. But once you look at Santa Rita do Sapucaí, and you let that data load, I'm going to do a cooking show, and I'm going to go to one when everything is loaded. Okay? You can immediately start learning, for instance, that Santa Rita appears to be like a manufacturing place because they export electrical machinery, broadcasting accessory, broadcasting equipment, insulated wire, and also a lot of mirrors. Okay? And the nice thing about this design, which is based on profiles, which is an idea that we're expanding for the new version, is that you can go down and look at different visualizations and learn about different things, or you can go deep and ask a follow-up question. So let's say that you're interested, oh shit, they export a lot of glass mirrors. Who do they export those mirrors to? So you click, it just says, what are the export destinations where these glass mirrors are going to? Oh, not surprisingly, it's Argentina. Argentinians like to look at themselves in the mirror. Therefore, they're buying all those mirrors from Santa Rita. And the nice thing about Data Viva is that we're not only looking at data of exports, but also we're able to look at the domestic economy. So here we have not only exports, but we have industries, which include services like computer programming or restaurants, and we can ask ourselves, for example, when it comes to computer programming, what are the occupations that are employed, in computer programming industries in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, and we say, information analyst, how much would you expect to pay an information analyst? Like 2,000 reals, a month. So you can even get information about what is the expected salary that an industry in a given location is paying for a particular occupation. So it's a very precise way of looking at this data that was otherwise trapped in the Minister of Labor. So I could go a little bit on, with you can look at occupations, you can look at where Santa Rita is on the PROAC space and try to understand, the opportunities that they have to export. But what I'm going to show you is that actually here we can go even a little bit further and try to see whether the occupations that are available in a location match, the ones that are required by a certain industry. So I'm going to continue using Santa Rita as an example. And what I'm going to look at now is at a visualization that is a little bit more complex, but also more insightful. And what is showing us here are the occupations that we estimate that are required by the aircraft manufacturing industry. So as you know, Brazil manufactures aircrafts, Embraer, like those little jetliners that you usually use on regional flights, are manufactured in Brazil. And because we know the places that manufacture those airliners, and we know the places that are successful at it. We can take information about what are the occupations that they employ there, how many people they employ in each category, and kind of like produce the matrix of the occupations that are required by that industry. And now we can overimpose what's available in Santa Rita to see what we have and what we're missing. So here, each circle represents, an occupation like aircraft mechanics. And for example, we estimate that you would need 18 aircraft mechanics, to be working in that manufacturing industry in a city of the size of Santa Rita to have, competitiveness, as it is explained by the metric of revealed comparative advantage. But in Santa Rita, you have none, and that's why the circle is empty. But there's other categories, for example, let's say metal equipment painters, for which you estimate that you need 14 of them, and in Santa Rita, even though you have no metal equipment painters working in the aircraft manufacturing industry, you have actually 30 of them working on other industries. So you wouldn't need to go outside of Santa Rita to hire them. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of how we can actually start going deeper and deeper into these observations. And finally, I'm going to complete the presentation by telling you guys one more story. As you can imagine, I spend a lot of time looking at data on industries and locations and occupations, and although I love that work, sometimes it can get a little bit tedious. And I start thinking about that it would be interesting to look at countries not only in terms of their economic production, but also in terms of their cultural production, even though getting data for that would be more difficult. So that's why we started another project that is called Pantheon. And just to explain simply what Pantheon means is that if you look at the UK in the Economic Complexity Observatory, you would see this matrix. If you look at the UK in Pantheon, you would see this very different matrix. Okay? And this is a matrix of the famous people that have been born within the boundaries of what is now the UK, during the last 6,000 years, and the cultural domains in which they participate. So here you have people like Shakespeare and Newton and Darwin and Adam Smith and so forth. Okay? How do we know, which people is famous enough? Well, the way that we do it is by leveraging a very simple trick. If you're famous enough, you should be documented in many different languages. Okay? We want globally famous people, not locally famous people. So we look at all people that have a presence in more than 25 languages in the Wikipedia. And the nice thing about this is that we can look at these matrices of cultural production across 6,000 years, because actually humanity, since we have been able to mediate information, we have developed an amazing capacity to remember things. So what I'm going to do with that is tell you one final story, which is the story of how, the types of people that become famous have changed as broadcasting technologies have changed. And this is a story that I'm going to borrow from Elizabeth Einstein, who wrote this wonderful book called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. And in that book, what Einstein does is that it tells us, that when the printing press was invented, it caused a big revolution because before there were very few books being produced. And when the number of books being produced increased, it did not just change the number of books being made, but it changed what was published, who was published, who were the publishers, what were the topics that people were publishing, So they were like the hot item, of the Renaissance. And basically what she's saying is that books catalyzed the Renaissance and the emergence of arts and science. So let's look at who we remember from before the year, 1350. The printing press, is from the year 1450, but this is by place of birth, so that's why I'm going 100 years before. And we see that, that matrix is much simpler. We have mostly, political leaders and religious figures. Not surprisingly, all prophets were born before the printing press. Okay, you make the math. And what is surprising also about this figure is not, who's there, but also who is missing. And you see that there's very few artists. Artists are here in yellow, and you see that there are very few artists, very few scientists, And what Elizabeth Einstein is telling us is that if we move this timeline towards, the time after the printing press, but before the invention of film and radio, we should see a change in which the arts and science become huge. So let's look at that. Now we're looking at people born between 1350 and 1875, and you see an increasing diversity in this cultural production matrix. This is the time of Newton and Faraday, and Louis Pasteur and Alfred Nobel, and mathematicians like Pascal and Gauss, So you see the explosion of sciences, but also an explosion on literature, and explosion in painting, and composers, So there's an explosion on the arts. But the nice thing about, this data set is that it allows us to look at other changes in broadcasting technologies. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was the introduction of film and radio. And with the introduction of film and radio, we should expect, the types of people that become famous, the type of information that it spreads, also to change. So let's look at how that, matrix looks like. And here we are looking at people born between 1875 and 1950. And you see that the arts are very big. You know, they're actually bigger than before. But now, the artists that are being highlighted are not composers or painters, are performing artists. You know? So with the introduction of film and radio, you know, it is the actor the one that becomes famous, not the playwright. You know? It is not, you know, the composer that much, but the musician and the singer that is on stage. You know? So you see, once again, like how media, in this case, you know, the broadcasting technology of film and radio, is changing the cultural production matrix. And to finish, you know, I'm going to look at the second half of the 20th century with the introduction of the telly. You know, because the telly is actually quite different than film. You know, because there are things that we watch in the telly that usually we don't go to the cinema to watch. And who becomes famous in the telly that was not famous, you know, in film? Any guess? Globally famous, not locally famous. So with the television, you have the rise of the famous sportsmen and sportswomen. So you have soccer players, race car drivers, tennis players, basketball players, and you name it. So as you can see, by taking data, you know, and creating these visualization engines, we have the ability to create like sort of these PowerPoint slides that have, you know, millions of possible slides and allow us to fish out, you know, stories out of them, helping us learn about the world and about the evolution of the information that we produce. Thank you very much.
Cesar, come back. We've got some questions. So we've got some important stuff. So you've got plenty of data, plenty of information. Yeah. What can you tell us about the UK economy over the next 10 years? What do we all need to be thinking about and concerned about in terms of skills gaps, in terms of what are we going to be producing?
So, like, the way to think about economies in general, and that should inform that question, is that you always want to think of economies in terms of their ability to crystallize imagination, to transform things that were originally like designed or thought into reality. And that's something that you don't want to lose. What has happened a little bit on the Western countries is that they have dismembered their capacity to make with that inventive process, you know, and that dismemberment, you know, by pushing manufacturing capacities to other countries that have been developing a great capacity to make and are developing design capacities now, you know, is some of the things that, you know, I think has made, you know, Europe and parts of the US lose that competitive edge. So you have to always focus on being able to, you know, embody your ideas physically into objects, into software, you know, but not just stay in the idea space.
Okay, so it's tangible objects rather than just IP or just ideas that are kind of vague and not kind of
you want both, exactly, because by making, it informs the creative process. And if you lose the part of making because you think that the making can be done by somewhere else, you're losing that backward feedback that gives you, you know, insights onto how to make those things better or what you should be making next and so forth.
Great. And one question about Pantheon.
Yeah.
How do you think it's going to change over the next 100 years? You looked at how it's kind of changed over sort of like the last 200 or 300 years. How do you think it's going to change, you know, over the next 100 years or so?
Yeah, so obviously that's very speculative, but, you know, the big change on media that we had is the internet. Yeah. And one thing about the internet that people don't realize that much is that actually it's a very literary media. It's very written, and the internet has encouraged two things. We read a heck of a lot on the internet, even if they're little pieces. Yeah. Okay? You know, every tweet is a headline, you know, and we're following to read a piece usually. You know, if it's not readable, sometimes you cannot access it in mobile and so forth. And the other thing is that it has developed an enormous fact-checking culture. Yeah. Okay, so now if everybody tells you like a fact and you don't believe it, you don't call bullshit, you just like take up your phone and you say if it's bullshit and then you call bullshit. Yeah. You know? So then within that context, you know, I think it's bringing the world a little bit back to the world of science, in which we're fact-checking, we're concerned about sort of like high-quality content, like truth, not so much about like beauty and pictorial stuff as it was in the world of television, which was very visual, very kind of like appealing to our bodies. This one appeals more to our minds.
Great. All right, so it can't be bullshit if it's on the internet, basically. Cesar, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. Yeah.